Shalom, everybody. Yes, we continue with the second of these three sessions on the rather apocalyptic title of Beyond the End of the World. So last week we talked about Moshe arriving at his end of the world, the end of the world point for Moshe, and how one imagines how he proceeds to create a future beyond the immediate end of his world. This time we're going to be talking about Jonah, Sefer Jonah, and we're going to be looking at the many enigmas and mysteries of the book of Jonah. It seems to me, it's always seemed to me, the most mysterious, the most enigmatic of all the books in Tanakh. Even not excluding the book of Job, Sefer Iyov. What are the mysteries here? What I'm calling the enigmas. Well, first of all, there's the whole question of Jonah's immediate reaction to God's call. Right? It begins with God's call. The story begins by Hidvar Hashem el Yonah ben Amittai. The word of God came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Kum lech el Nineveh. Rise up and go to Nineveh. Now, rise up and go. What's the effect of that rise up? Why not just say lech el Nineveh? It seems to add a certain energy. God wants of Jonah a certain energetic movement towards Nineveh, that great city. Now, that's the description of Nineveh, that it's a great city. It's a metropolis. It's one of the cities of the world. Right? You can't think of that world that, in a sense, is coming to an end now without thinking of Nineveh. And Nineveh, as a great city, is waiting, in a sense, it doesn't know that it's waiting, for you to arise and ukra aleha, and cry out against it, cry out as a denunciation of that city, ki altara atam lefanai, because their evil has risen up before me. And here is God talking about his own presence, and that in his own presence, within his purview, within his perception, now he can't help paying attention to Nineveh because of its evil. Alta ra'atam. It's risen up kind of irrevocably in front of me, and judgment will have to be done. So Jonah is sent with a certain force by God, kum lech, and what we immediately read after that, and that's the first and the prevailing mystery, vayakam Jonah levroach tarshisha, milifnei Hashem. Jonah, it seems almost obediently, and the story is full of these paradoxes. God said, kum, vayakam, and so the text makes it sound as if he's doing exactly what God told him. He rose up with energy. But he rose up not to go to Nineveh, but to flee to Tarshish from the presence of God, from that area within God's perception, which is, of course, an unlimited area. He thinks he can somehow escape God's notice. But he's going to flee from the presence of God, and in his flight, he moves with some energy. Vayered Yaffo. He went down to Jaffa, to the seaport. Right, that one does go down towards the sea in Hebrew diction, and he finds a ship there. It's on its way to Tarshish, and he pays his full fee. In other words, he doesn't want to be owing anything. He's very meticulous and energetic and efficient in order to come with them to Tarshish, milifnei Hashem, away from the presence of God. So here you have a kind of very conscientious and thoroughgoing Jonah, who is using a lot of energy and intention in order to get away from God. Livroach milifnei Hashem. And the enigma in this, of course, is, well, first of all, there is just the plain theological truth that we know, and we suppose everyone else knows at this point, and that is that you can't leave the presence of God. Since God is everywhere, one is always in his presence. There is no entering into his beam, his eye beam, and leaving it. That God sees everything. And that's something of a cliche, something of a biblical cliche. You have midrashim that actually start, midrashic passages that begin, I think this is one in the Mechilta, that begins by saying, surely Jonah knew it. Everyone knows that you can't do that. After all, aren't there a lot of sources, a lot of quotations, says the Midrash, that you can look up in Tanakh, in the scriptures, in which you will find clear references to God's total knowledge, the total clarity of his perception, and his inescapability. So there's no way you can do that. So what can be meant, theologically speaking, by fleeing the presence of God? What interests me more is the twin enigma, which is not so much a theological one as a psychological one. What is it from Jonah's point of view that he thinks he is doing by fleeing from the presence of God? That is, there is here a puzzle about his inner world. He has an intention. Does he not know that's impossible? Of course he knows. So, as I say over and over again, you get all the classic commentaries saying, the Ibn Ezra, for instance, saying, but he was a wise man, otherwise God wouldn't have chosen him as a prophet. And of course he knew the ways of God with his creatures. And therefore, since he had a high level of theological knowledge, what could have possessed him to think he could flee from the presence of God? Now that is, in a way, you might say, it could be an unanswerable question. The story could have played out in such a way that we never get to find out. And indeed, at first, it seems very, the story seems to work on a pragmatic level. We hear the plot. He goes down to Yaffo, he goes down into the ship, he goes down into the hold of the ship 3 times Vayeret. There is a movement downward, a movement of energy. He seems to know exactly where he wants to go. And he goes down into the Yaketeah Esvina, into the hold of the ship, as far down as you can get. Vayeradam. And with great, I would say again, there's something energetic and purposeful about his going down to that deep place in the belly of the ship and falling deep asleep, falling into a stupor. Vayeradam. That's the tardema of that's the slumber that was cast on Adam by God, in order that out of that quasi-death, that anesthesia, a new thing will come to the world. Yeah, a woman suddenly emerges from Adam's side. And here you have Jonah clearly, intentionally opting for stupor. Another question. And then, just moving very, very quickly then through the story, we become aware of how Jonah seems to be surrounded by many objects and forces that are called gadol, that are called, first the city was called big, and then there is a great storm, and then there is a great fish, and then there is a forceful wind when he arrives in Nineveh. Over and over again, the word gadol is used 14 times, actually, in the course of the book. Everything from Jonah's perspective. And I think Jonah's perspective is what has to interest us from now on. God's perspective is in some way occluded by Jonah's dream of himself, by the way in which he imagines or fantasizes his relation to the world. And one way in which we find out about his primal fantasies is this word gadol, that everything around him is imagined by him as great, that there is something about him that is infantile. I don't mean that necessarily negatively, but he senses himself at base, he senses himself as somehow very small, that he is surrounded by enormous forces. And the enormous forces are the storm at sea, the power of the waves, and the sense of imminent death. And then these elemental forces, at the end later, it's the force of the wind, that rises in the city of Nineveh, again a great force, and kills that little kikayon that Jonah has found in the misery of his soul, ra'at nafsho. And I'm looking now at the last chapter of the book of Jonah. We'll go back to the beginning afterwards. We're looking now for some solution to the question of what was it that Jonah thought he was doing in this flight from God, this literal, clearly in his mind it's not metaphorical, although we can translate it into psychological terms. For him, there is something very literal about it. He is fleeing from God, and what we read then in chapter 4, I'm starting at the beginning, at the end of chapter 3, the people of Nineveh, once this doom is pronounced against them, once Jonah has finally yielded after the unfortunate experience in the fish, in the great fish, Jonah has been spat out by the fish. Another way of saying he's reborn, he's thrown out onto the dry land. And from there he does proceed to Nineveh, and people of Nineveh respond by surrendering with an unprecedented surrender to God. They do a most theatrical tshuva. They repent with sackcloth and ashes that even extends to their cattle. And the king makes announcements about fasting and about all the panoplies and all the details of repentance. Ulai, perhaps the answer is, perhaps what will happen, says the king, mi yodea, who knows? And that is a new tone we're hearing now, who knows? It's rather tentative, a sense of mystery. Perhaps God will turn back, Yashuv, he will do tshuva, and he will repent, v'shav mecharonapo, and he will turn away from his anger, and we will not perish, perhaps. That's the king of Nineveh's motivation for fasting and so on. And then we read, Vayar ha'elokim et ma'asehem, God saw their deeds, he had seen their evil before, that they had turned away from their evil way, midarkam hara'ah. So there is the evil way of human beings has been relinquished, and so God changes his mind. Vayinachem. He thinks again about the evil which he had proposed to do to them, and he didn't do it. So in a sense here, we have a sense of the options that God had. He had said he would do one thing, and it doesn't happen. He doesn't do it. Human evil has now made God move away from his own evil, from his own evil intention, from his own doom on that world of Nineveh. And then we go into the last chapter, Vayera Jonah ra'a gedola vayichar lo. And it was evil to Jonah, and a great evil, and he was agitated, angry, perhaps depressed. The word vayichar tends to mean sometimes not so much anger as depression. If you want it to mean anger, then it usually has the word af, vayichar afu. He was agitated, he was disturbed to the roots of his being. This is what I call the world coming to an end. Here is harav alav olamo, that Talmudic expression that we talked about last week. Subjectively for Jonah, his world is falling into ruin. He is deeply in deep turmoil. And he prays to God as he says, please, oh Lord, please God, isn't this what I said while I was still on my ground, while I was still on the earth of my own country, when I was still somehow stable, before things had changed, while I was still there, before I had started traveling and fleeing? Wasn't that what I said? I always knew, in other words. Even if I didn't say it out loud, that's what I was thinking. And that's why I preempted you by fleeing to Tarshish. God said, you said I should go to Nineveh, and I went to the other end of the known world. In other words, I was putting a whole world between you and me. Why did I do that? Well, I had a conception of things then. I had an expectation, and now you're just proving how right I was. What was the expectation? Ki yadati ki ata kel chanun v'rachum. For I knew that you are a gracious and merciful God, erech apayim, long-suffering, rav chesed, of abundant loving kindness, v'nicham al hara'ah, and changing your mind about evil. That when it comes to evil, it's easy for you to be swayed. That you are full of that temperament that is called rav chesed, of great loving kindness. Now, these, of course, are these terms, these epithets, are the epithets that when we read Sefer Yonah in Shul, if we do get to Shul on Yom Kippur, these epithets, these attributes of God, are the ones that we keep on reciting constantly throughout Yom Kippur, Kel Chanun V'Rachum, as a theurgic moment, that is, as a way, in some way, of putting our attention and God's attention on the way we hope He will be, on those midot, on those characteristics, that He will emphasize those, that He'll bring those out of latency, out of some kind of disguise, and move to a different seat, to move from the seat of strict law, punishment, evil, to the seat of loving kindness. So throughout Yom Kippur, we have been reciting, it's almost an incantation, very devoutly recited, about how we would like God to be, as if God has different personae that He presents to the world. And indeed, in Kabbalistic literature, that is the case. In having different personae, God is like no one so much as the human being. The human being also can change. There can be a tshuva for the human being to put one's best foot forward, one's best face forward, and to allow a certain side of our being to come to the front. And during Yom Kippur, we ask for God to do the same thing, as if there is a kind of dance or a drama where we want to meet God in that place of loving kindness and compassion. But here Yonah is inverting the emotion and the intention of this very powerful passage, this incantation. And he is saying, I always knew you were like that. I always knew that you, in a sense, you couldn't be relied on to execute evil. But when it comes to evil, you always somewhere tend to move away from that. And that's what makes Yonah sick with anger. I want to use that expression. Vayira el Yonah ra'a gedola, and it was evil to Yonah, a great evil. He was agitated. Now the Abarbanel actually says that here at this moment he's plunged into its itzron nafsho, into a great sadness, and that is choli, and he calls it illness. Choli means in some way that there is an emotional illness that has overtaken Yonah at this point, and in some way the whole story has been preparing for it. So are we to regard Yonah as someone who is a pathological image of someone who for some reason deplores and hates chesed? The mystery of this is in no way aided, right? We're not resolved in any way. Yonah says this with a great sense of vindication. You see, I always knew you were this. So the music of what Yonah says is very affirmative, as it were. Just say, you see, I'm right. I always was right. That's why I fled. By saying this, however, he is actually making it clear that subjectively he's still fleeing, that he hasn't actually turned aside from his decision to flee, because when it comes to it, when it comes right down to it, he thinks he was right in fleeing. What can all this mean? What is wrong with Yonah? Is it a pathology that's peculiar to him? In which case, why do we read about it on Yom Kippur at that most delicate and vulnerable time of the day, as it always seems to me, the time, mincha, right? It's not Erev. It's just before the evening begins to fall, as the day begins to turn. And in that moment, before the gates are shut, before things become unequivocal, there's a kind of twilight moment, right? It's before twilight, a twilight moment. And in that sensitized moment, as I always feel it, I always want to be there in Shul for the reading of this. Why do I want to read this, right? I can only talk from my personal viewpoint. There are people who don't see any point in reading Jonah. I have actually seen things like that on the internet, that it seems so absurd. What is with Jonah? And yet for me, when I hear it, there is something that doesn't make sense and yet makes sense, and it's not making sense. Something rings true here. Something rings true in the very limited range of Jonah's perceptions here at the end. What does Jonah say basically to God? Again, for a second time actually, he says to God, Kach na et nafshi mimeni, take my life from me, ki tov moti michayai, because my death is better than my life. That's the point he's got to now. He hasn't emerged from the turmoil, let's say, of the sea, when he clearly at that point also wanted, there was a death wish there. He is the one who asks the sailors, throw me into the sea. Lift me up and throw me into the sea. And even if he had some positive motive in this, to save the sailors from their doom, nevertheless, it's clear that there is some kind of death wish there. And then, somehow inconsistently, he wants to die, but then when the fish swallows him, he prays to God to be saved, as it were. Now, we'll see it's not quite so simple. There's an ambiguity about that too, because after all, his prayer from the belly of the fish is in the past tense and not in the future tense. In other words, prayer should be in the future tense. You know, I'm in trouble, please save me. And instead, what you have in chapter 2 is that God prepares this great fish, swallows him, and he prays to God, his God. This is the first of his two prayers. And both of them are around a death wish from the belly of the whale. And he said, Karati mitzara li el Hashem vaya'aneni. I have called out from my trouble to God, and he has responded to me. He has answered me. I called out from my trouble, and I'm all right now. What kind of a prayer is this in the past tense? It's as if there's a foregone conclusion that he is already saved. Whereas the fact is that he's still in there, in the body of the fish, the great whale, in that belly, which according to a rather macabre midrash, since the dog suddenly becomes a daga. You know, suddenly we see the male fish transforming before our eyes into a female fish. There's this fantastical and very powerful idea that comes up in the midrash that now suddenly Jonah is forced to pray. A prayer is squeezed out of him because he's really in Sarah now. He is in present tense Sarah. Why? Because this female fish, her womb is full of embryos, of little fish embryos. The exact number is given in the midrash, 365,000 embryos fill up the belly of the fish. And so, very literally, Jonah is in Sarah. He is squeezed. He has tight living quarters. Suddenly, it's hard for him to live in that place. And we get a sense now of a very physical, concrete sense of pressure on Jonah to do this thing called prayer. He does it, and God responds to it. But he does it in a strange way. He doesn't do it with a full sense of the vulnerability of his actual situation. As it were, he turns it into the past tense. And I hear that as a kind of denial. It's a way of denying one's present situation. I'm already so confident that the story is going to end well that I can afford, as it were, to put it in the past tense. But the fact is that this is a man who just found himself in the sea because he really wanted to be in the sea and not on dry land. He really wanted to die. And that you can find in another rather famous midrash, in the Chilta, Lo halach Jonah ela la'abed atzmo bayam. He didn't move, he didn't flee for any other reason that he wanted to lose himself, to destroy himself, actually, right? To commit suicide in the sea. It's a certain kind of suicide. And he asks to be thrown into the sea at this point. And then God saves him. He is reborn. And then again he prays in Nineveh. And again, and this time explicitly, he says, take my life from me because my death is better than my life. And then there's a very strange dialogue between God and Jonah. And God asks Jonah, Haitev charalacha? Are you right to be so angry, to be so upset? What is this strange kind of upset that you have that somehow accompanies you, consciously or unconsciously? A kind of anxiety that you're not willing actually to acknowledge. And then we read about the shelter of the kikayon, this mustard seed tree, rather nondescript little plant that grows up over Jonah and gives him shade over his head, to shade him or save him from his evil. From his evil would mean from his suffering, because he's just plain hot. He's sitting under the merciless sun on a very hot day outside the city. And that's another of the rather mysterious characteristics of this book. The appeal to elemental physical life, that what Jonah comes now to experience, and we're given the full weight of that experience, is very physical sensation. The sensation of being hot, for instance. We are given a very deeply felt account of what that feels like, right? Something that in our part of the world we know very well. And it was when the sun shone, right, in the morning, God prepared an east wind, a rough east wind, and the sun smote Jonah's head, and he fainted from the heat. And he asked his soul to die, and he said, Tov mutimi chayai. So even if it hadn't been enough before that he wanted to die, now he is physically overwhelmed, and he wants to die. God said to Jonah again, is it good that you are angry? That's the only good here is the good of death, apparently. And God questions that. There's a strange dialogue now. And here this time God said, are you right to be so upset about this little kikayon, this insignificant plant? And Jonah answers, Hetev charali ad mavet. I am rightly agitated up to the point of death. I'm ready to die in my sense of the world coming to an end. There's something here that simply can't be I have no way of dealing with it. And then God makes his famous and enigmatic response, which ends the book. And if we look to that response for some kind of solution, some kind of key to what has been happening here, then we will not be gratified. You remember how the ending goes. God says, you have been concerned, atachasta ala kikayon, for the gourd, this gourd as it's often translated traditionally, over which you did not labor and which you did not rear. You didn't invest in it at all. You have nothing to do with it, really. It arose up overnight. It came into being overnight, and overnight it was destroyed. It vanished. It disappeared. To be or not to be. Kikayon becomes an image of transience, of life and death. Va'ani lo achusi. You're concerned for this example of transience. Shouldn't I have pity on Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 12 myriad human beings, 120,000 human beings, who don't know the difference between their right hand and their left, and many cattle. And we don't know how that ending goes towards answering the questions of the book. What is God really saying to Jonah? It's not an ending that resolves anything. On the contrary, it leaves us somewhere with a question. The actual question of God, right? We don't hear Jonah answering him. It's a kind of rhetorical question God is asking, and he is justifying his loving kindness, his concern, his pity. And in some way, he's connecting himself with Jonah. Here is you and here are me. You had concern for the Lord, and shouldn't I? But what is actually the connection? Jonah wasn't really concerned for the life of the gourd in itself. After all, he was concerned for himself. He wanted the shade. How could you compare that with God's gratuitous mercy for a city that, after all, he has created, and 120,000 human beings? Surely the scale here is very, very different. It should really bring us to a standstill. And so we end the book, it seems to me, with a sense of bewilderment. And it's a sense of bewilderment that somehow fits into the nature of the day. And that's what I want to spend the time we now have trying to spell out, trying in some way to tease out. I have to say that I had a kind of Jonah moment. Before I teach Sefer Jonah particularly, I'm slightly obsessed because of the enigmas, because I feel that there's no real resolution to enigmas, and perhaps enigmas can never be fully resolved. It's part of the nature of enigmas that they leave mystery. But I had a kind of Jonah moment yesterday, actually, yes. I was watching a film about the Space Challenger, the doomed spaceship, I think it was 1987, 1986, that was sent out by NASA. And we see at some length in the film, we get to know the families, we get to know people's excitement about the project, all the work that goes into it technically, people's dreams and hopes. There's actually a woman teacher on board to show in a way that anyone can do this, that this is not just for expert astronauts, but it is something that everyone, space has become like our backyard. Right? And then what happens, as with great excitement, the families crane their necks upwards to watch the vertical movement up into space with the burning rocket behind, and then after 1 minute, the knowledge that things have gone badly wrong. I don't quite know how to describe what may sound like a rather naive reaction on my part. I was extremely deeply disturbed. After all, there are other stories about sudden deaths, of unexpected deaths, of Charav Alehem Olamam, of people whose world has suddenly been ruined for them. But when you look at the faces of the families there, and you look with a certain empathy, then it seemed to me, strictly speaking, unbearable. There is something unthinkable about this. And I tried to understand what seemed to me so unthinkable and so, I have to say, traumatic, really. Traumatic for me. Never mind the actual participants. And it seemed to me that it has something to do with the gap between two ways of looking at things. One way is that, well, of course we can do it. After all, there are very intelligent people here at work, and people have dreams, and they know how to fulfill them. That we live in a world, as we increasingly do, in a world of competence and success, can do. We can do it. And we have great justification for that confidence. So much so that what should properly be another world up there, a world that has nothing to do with ours, right? It's the Shamayim. So I don't think it really correlates with the Shamayim as when God is called the God of the heavens. It's simply a parallel, it seems to me. Space is a parallel to what the sea is for Jonah. The vulnerability of Jonah, the sense that death lies in the sea, the sense that there's no possibility of stability, is the other side of the coin of technical efficiency and technical proficiency that should have ensured a successful mission, as there had always been before that point. The idea then that a mere problem of what is the mystery, it's something very small in the end. It's so small that it's incredible. That certain seals that were meant to, rubber seals that were meant to seal the heating elements in the rocket, misfitted. They slipped out of place because it was a cold day, because it was a very cold day. On that slippage, in which you could be interested technically, right? You could regard that as a subject of interest of one part of your mind, and with the other part of our mind, with the other part of the human mind, we know that 7 people died because of this. And these are people who are beautiful and brilliant and full of the best that human beings can be. That's how they're presented. How can that world, how is it possible that such a thing can happen? That these two worlds of material proficiency and failure on the one hand, and the world of a human being in which, what can I say, such material excellence shouldn't have such great power. How can they come together in one moment of fission like that? Now, it sounds like a naive protest against reality, but it seems to me this idea of the vulnerability of human beings as opposed to the ability of human beings represents two different worlds. And I want to look at some sources with you that describe the relationship of the sea and the dry land in terms something like this. Number 1 on your page. I'm going to read them rather quickly. Yordei Hayam, this is Psalm 107, and it talks about sailors. What is the experience of those who go down to sea? And you can keep spaceships in mind for their similarity or dissimilarity. Those who go down to the sea in ships, they ply their trade in the mighty waters. They're very businesslike. They know what they're doing. Osei melacha. They have seen the works of God and his wonders in the deep. Nifla otav is something that is wonderful, as we would say, amazing, but it's also something that has a sinister edge to it, incomprehensible, that there is something beyond human understanding about what goes on in the depths of the water from the human perspective. And by his word, he raised a storm wind that made the waves surge, mounting up to the heaven, plunging down to the depths. Suddenly you get a sense of what it's like to be in a boat, in a ship, that is rising up to the heavens and plunging down to the depths. Yardu tohomot, nafsham bera'a titmogag. Their lives, their body is disgorged in their misery. That's one translation. They simply throw up in their misery, in the sense of physical evil, the sense of physical violence that is turning their stomachs upside down. They dissolve from the inside. The kishkas fall apart as they bounce up and down in the sea. Yahogu v'yanu'u. They reeled and they staggered, a very physical description of instability, of not having a place here in the sea. This is not your place. Kashikor, like a drunken man. V'chol chochmatam titbala. And all their, right, I don't like the translation, all their skills were to no avail. That's a very understated translation. Kol chochmatam titbala, all their wisdom was swallowed up. That is, they are engulfed in the force of the sea, which isn't interested in what they think. It isn't interested in their great wisdom and sophistication and their know-how. When it comes right down to it, you are dealing with forces. I won't say that are insuperable, invincible, but they have to be respected. because they belong to another world. This is not your world for living in. God didn't make things that way. And it's not that, right? And then we read in the last line, Vayitzaku el Hashem. And so what do they do in their adversity? They cry out to God, but sar lahem, in that sense of enormous pressure upon their humanity. Umimitzukotehem yotziem. And in their and he saved them from their troubles. He saved them from their terrible pressures. That is, these sailors become the types of those who react to that impossible attempt to be both a dry land creature and a space creature at the same time, a sea creature at the same time. That brings out a certain obvious physical vulnerability. The flesh is vulnerable, and what you do when you're in a situation where you really experience this is that you cry out to God. That's just obvious. You cry out of a recognition of vulnerability, out of tzara. That's how it has to be. It's obvious that that's the life of the sailor. And now I'd like to remind us of what the captain of the ship says when he comes down into the hold and looks for Jonah. He knows he's got an absent passenger, that Jonah has disappeared. And so he says, if you look at your source page, it's the Midrash, Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, is 4a. We're going to be bouncing around a little bit. What does he say to Jonah? He really reproaches him. And he says to Jonah, it's in chapter 1, verse 7, verse 6. And the captain of the ship came to him, and he said to him, Malacha nirdam, what are you doing sleeping? Kum kra, there's that expression again. Rise up and cry out to your God. Just like all the other sailors are doing. Everyone else has been crying out to their God. What are you doing? What on earth are you doing sleeping? Malacha. How does it seem to you? What on earth do you think you're doing? Something like that. Where is your alert sensibility, subjectivity? You seem to be deep asleep. You seem to be in some kind of real torpor. You're absent. So, cry to your God. Perhaps he will bethink himself for us and we will not perish. So there is here a chance, and it's a chance that's offered only by prayer. And it's not more than a chance. Have a look now at the Midrash on this verse. The Karu ish el Elohav, people cried out, the sailors cried out each to his God, v'lo ho'ilu, and the prayers didn't work. Ineffective prayers, because the gods are not gods. But Jonah, in the trouble of his soul, in the trouble of his life, it's really not the soul, it's the embodied soul. In his physical, his psychosomatic trouble, fell asleep, deep asleep. Right? He fell into this torpor because of his strange, inconsistent state of mind. Ba'elav Rava Chobel, so the captain came to him and said to him, and here the Midrash puts it a little bit differently. Not just, why are you sleeping? Harei anu omdim bein mavet l'chayim. Here we are standing between death and life. And you are sleeping, you're deep asleep. What should you be doing, right? Obviously, you should be crying to your God. Why? And here is the midrashic way of saying it. You're standing between death and life. You have one foot in life and one foot in death. It's a way of saying you're right on the edge. And indeed, in a storm like this, right, in what could become a shipwreck any moment, even the ship itself thinks it's about to be broken up, right, in the rather fantastical words of the story, chishva, right? So the ship could feel that it was going to be broken up, right? So everything is somewhere in the physical reality. It's invested in the physical reality. Don't you feel where you're standing? You're standing at the liminal place between life and death. What you have to do when you stand in that place is pray, cry out to God. And so I'd like to say, and this is by way of beginning to deal with some of the enigmas that we talked about. When we're told that he flees from God, perhaps what we're being told is fleeing from God, what would be the opposite of fleeing from God? What should he have done instead of fleeing from God? It's not just a general metaphor, in its freestanding to flee from the presence of God. It has implications about it. What would be the opposite? What is it that he is fleeing from doing, not just from the presence of God? He is fleeing from, it seems to me, from standing in the presence of God. That what we have here is a refusal or an inability, a denial of the situation of standing between life and death, which is the situation of the human being in the presence of God. You'd have to say at all times. The shipwreck is just a very graphic and kinetic, nauseating example of what it means not to be in a stable place. But nevertheless, that's your position. You are there. And if you are there, then you should stand there and pray. Hold that position and pray to your God, because that is your realistic position. That notion of standing in the presence of God as implying a kind of, right, the amidah, the prayer is the standing prayer. And to stand in the presence of God would mean to hold to the instability of that position, not to forget either life or death, not to lose one's desire for life in despair at the fragility of this position, and not to rush into death, or on the other hand, not to deny death and somehow act as if one has a freehold on life. And so it's a very precarious position. Okay? A position in which, right in the middle of the sea or in the middle of space, in which one's vulnerability comes out very forcefully. And Jonah refuses to hold that position. That's the reading that I'm suggesting here. What do we have then? We have an image. We have an image of outer space. Sorry, of the depths of the sea. Of the depths of the sea. And I wanted in this context, this unstable context of another world in which Jonah is not at home. And he's being asked somewhere. When God says, rise up and cry out, not only to cry out against Nineveh, but to cry out from his own being, to find that place, that unstable place of prayer. And there's a line from D.H. Lawrence that I always like when I think of what it is to stand before the presence of God, stand in the presence of a king. D.H. Lawrence talks about man in his wholeness, wholly attending. There's a certain posture of tension when man is in his wholeness with all parts of him, all the contradictory parts of him, wholly attending to who and where he is. Somewhere that kind of existential stability and instability. And I want to take a risk here and read you a short passage from Kafka's notebooks. We had Kafka last week on Moshe, and this time I want to read a nonsense passage, an absurd passage. I can't resist it. Kafka says this: I can swim like the others. So yes, I can swim just like the others. Only I have a better memory than the others. I have not forgotten my former inability to swim. I have not forgotten the former inability to swim. But since I have not forgotten it, being able to swim is no help to me. So after all, I cannot swim. Now here is Kafka at his most absurd. He starts off by saying, common sensibly, I can swim like the rest of you. I'm a common sense human being. I can learn to swim just like everybody else. But think in how many different tones one could say that. How much feeling of either competence or vulnerability one could have experienced when one was learning to swim. He says, after all, I'm different than the rest of you, but I have a better memory than you. And I remember my ultimate vulnerability. I remember that I couldn't swim at one point. I remember when I floundered. And that floundering feeling, since I have a good memory, is always with me. Anything I felt is still part of me. And so how can I swim? So being able to swim now is no help to me, because in a way, I'm pulled back into that deep level of my being, which my unconscious knowledge, my deep knowledge that I can't swim. So I'm basically a creature who doesn't know, who's helpless, who doesn't know how to fend for itself completely effectively in the world. So after all, I cannot swim. So he has moved from I'm able to swim like the rest of them to, after all, I cannot swim. What disables him? It's actually a sense of having a good memory. I haven't denied, I haven't left behind me that part of myself that can't swim. And that becomes, for Kafka, who uses the image of swimming more than once, in his notebooks and in other places, that becomes a kind of symbolic image of the difficulty of making any affirmative, confident statement in the world. And at the same time, there is that common sense dimension of human beings in which I can return to sometimes, and I can say certain things with confidence. I can swim. I can not only swim, I'm a champion swimmer. It turns out that Kafka was a very good swimmer. I read a fascinating article about him this week. He was a very good swimmer, and he loved swimming, and it was impossible for him not to swim. He said of himself, when the doctor wanted him to swim less, he was afraid that Kafka's illness, his tuberculosis, had been caused partly by overstrain of the lungs in swimming, and he suggested that Kafka stop swimming, and he said that's impossible. It's impossible for me to stop swimming because, in a way, I'm a fish in water. It does me good. And on the other hand, I can't swim. I'm not able to swim. Now, that sense of helplessness as part of one's equipment as a human being, the sense that a deep truth, and not one to be ashamed of, in the human psyche, is the sense of not being able to do it, helplessness. The sense, Adam Phillips, the British psychoanalyst, talks about this, writes about this. He says something about the lure of self-sufficiency, the lure, the temptation to tell oneself a story of self-sufficiency. Now, that's a complex observation. Normally, we tend to privilege self-sufficiency, and certainly in our culture, that competence and getting on top of things and not allowing things to intimidate you, and you don't allow the elements, even the elements, the wind and the rain and the heat of the sun. You find your ways of regulating the elements so that you can live in your place in the world. You have your solid place in the world. There is no real problem about it. And he calls that whole kind of consciousness a lure. It's a temptation. We like to think that that's the whole truth. It may be part of the truth, but it's not the whole truth. As Winnicott, D.W. Winnicott, the great British psychoanalyst, said, all philosophers were once babies. That is the incongruity of it. That however wise you are, however developed your consciousness is, the baby is there inside you with all the frustration. That is one of the gifts of psychoanalysis, and it's a rather dubious gift, because we become aware of the traumatized parts of ourselves that perhaps, they're there, and we prefer not to notice them. We prefer not to pay attention to them until they cause us trouble, until we find ourselves denying the existence of elements around us and surrounding us and engulfing us that are really beyond us, that we can't actually deal with. With this, let's look at some more sources. Have a look at number 2. the Beit Yaakov, a hassidic source. The Beit Yaakov was the son of the Ishbitzer, of the Mea Shiloh, end of the 19th century. Starting at the beginning, number 2. Quoting a midrash, God created the world in 3 sections, 3 levels. Yeshuv, Yam, Umidbar. There is the settled territory, the territory of cities where people inhabit those places and build them up into civilizations, where they can settle. They can live in full sense of having a place in the universe. And then there is the sea, which is a different kind of world, and then there is the midbar, the wilderness. And then he goes on to say something about the difference, and I want to simplify it here, and simply take the 3, the triptych here, and simplify it to a diptych, to a binary thing. There is Yeshuv and there is Yam, and midbar is like the Yam. What can we say about Yeshuv? Yeshuv is a place where the creation has a solid place to be, Havaya. But the sea is a medium in which it seems there is no glory of God. There is nothing rational and fixed and worked out and wise. Human wisdom, human understanding is at a complete loss in the sea. Ein da'atam, right? He quotes from actually a couple of midrashim here. He says, you are now wanted to flee to the sea. Why? Because there, in the sea, we don't find any mention of the glory of God. Right? On the earth, the whole earth is filled with his glory. And there's another quotation about the heavens that say that God's glory is upon the heavens. But there's no quotation, we don't have a handy quote about God being in the sea. And so from the point of view of human fantasy, human imagination, the sea is a place in which God is not. It's a place of chaos, of other elements that simply seem to have their own way. The power of the waves, the power of the wind, right? That's what you find at sea, and the human being can't see a reflection of his own being in the sea. Ein sham koach surat adam hitpashek. He can't find a solid place to be in the sea, in his imagination. Ein da'atan miyushevet alehem. Yordei hayam, right? This is a quote from the Gemara here in the text. Those who go down to the sea in ships, their mind is not settled upon them. That is, it's not just they're physically disheveled, rumpled, they're tossing up and down, but their mind is in agitation. That is, they don't have Yeshuv Hadat. The Yeshuv Hadat is precisely that sense of competence, of objectivity, of looking at things, building up a civilization. By the nature of things, you can't have that at sea. It represents the opposite of that whole human enterprise. That's where you can't find the God's glory in the sea. Or at least that's how it seems to human beings. Why is the sea, right, that God, before God created the world, he goes on to say, there was only God. There was only amorphous, right, the sense of God's glory, filling space in the Ein Sof, in the limitless sense. But when God created a world, what happened then, and here I want to actually segue from this passage, if you will look now at number 6, let's have a look at another account of the creation of the world, and also having to do with where God is and where we are. God here, we have at number 6, we have a description of why God created the world. What did he need a world for? This is Likutei Moharan, this is Rabbi Nachman, Bratzla. God created the world because of his compassion, because he wanted to reveal his compassion. Now, this is a highly mystical statement. It means that God had a capacity for compassion and he had no one to lavish it upon. So he had to create a concrete world upon which he could lavish his compassion. He could make his compassion real and effective. If there had not been a creation of a world, who would he have who would have been the object of his compassion. So the sense of needing an object for a very powerful impulse in the godly. And that's why he created the whole creation from beginning to end, and the physical world, in order to display his compassion. And here then follows the very famous idea in Rabbi Nachman. When God wanted to create the world, there was no place, no space to create it in, because all you had was Ein Sof, was infinite. You only had God's infinite, unshaped, unformed being. So there was no object. There was only the subjectivity of God, the endless, infinite subjectivity of God. But God wanted an object. How could he create an object? Only by clearing away, condensing his own light and leaving an empty space. And suddenly you have an idea of Chalal HaPanui, an empty space without God in it. In that space, all kinds of technologies, if I want to call it that in the largest sense, all kinds of technologies could be created. Where there isn't that infinite light, where it is, there cannot be these limited objects. But when God clears an empty space, a vacuum, what you have is things like time and space. Kol hayamim v'hamidot, the days of the week, right? The sense that each day has a different function, perhaps. You distinguish the days of the week. All the havdalot, all the fragmented world, each piece specialized in order to achieve some particular end. All that becomes possible once God has left this empty space. And so you end up with a classic, profound paradox, as he says himself. He says, without that space, there couldn't have been the creation of the world. Without that space, there would have been no room, no solid place for the world to exist. And that is what happens when God reduces, tzimtzum, he condenses himself, shekaviyachol tzimtzem elokuto misham. As it were, what it means, and we have to use expressions like as it were. As it were, he condensed, he shrank his godliness out of that space. He retracted it out of that space. And here you end up with a paradox. In that space, then, there was no God. God was absent, as it were, from that space. But on the other hand, because if it hadn't been empty, then there would have been no world. On the other hand, if there can be no space, there can be no empty space without God. Ein makom aval be'emet la'amito b'vadai. But the truth is, right, we feel that, we imagine that there can be no space for God, no space for humanity, no space for a settled world, unless God withdraws in some way. There has to be a diminishing of God's presence. And on the other hand, the truth is that there can be no diminishing of God's presence. And if there is life anywhere, then that life has God's presence in it. In some way, and he says this is shnei hafachim. It's two opposite ideas. It's two opposite ideas that are impossible to understand. Ein lahasik. There's no way of understanding. And he ends with that again. Al kain iyashar lahasik cloud. There's no possible way of fathoming, of comprehending this idea of the empty space. Ad la'atid level, till the world to come, till some future, but not in this world. Now, what do we have here? We have a sense of an impossible paradox. And it's a paradox that it seems to me you are now faces. It's the paradox of there can be no place without God, on the one hand. That is, who am I? I am a tiny, meaningless creature. The power of God is everywhere. On the other hand, I am all but omnipotent because God has cleared a space from me. He has cleared himself away, at least to make it look. It's a kind of game. It's a thought game of some kind. To make it look as if the Yeshuv, right, the place of solid being, where I'm firmly, my identity and my world is firmly outlined. I know exactly where I stop and where I start, as if that is important and as if that is as if that is meaningful. And somewhere one has to live, one has to find a way of living with both those truths at the same time. And the two truths are, that in the rest of the passage, he'll go on to say, it's some kind of balance is needed between those two truths. On the one hand, a sense of omnipotence, a human sense of omnipotence, on the other hand, one of total fragility. And it just takes a little point. So he wants to give it's a quote from quotation from the Zohar, to change a chet into a hay, to change a hay into a chet, all you need is to close that little line, to put one point. For the sofer, it's just a matter of a touch of the pen, and a hay becomes a chet. And hallel becomes hallel. That is, there is a sense there that's been moved from praising God to profaning God by getting the balance wrong, by either imagining that you're everything or imagining that you're nothing. Because God may not need you. Bet Yaakov, both he and Rabbi Nachman say this. It would be somehow be heretical to say that God needs human beings who will perceive him. On the other hand, God is equally heretical to say that God has no wish for us. It isn't that God needs us. It's a very fine line. He has a desire for our being. He has a desire for something from us. So to say that we're nothing, we're totally fragile, would also be a problem. And all you need is, it's a kind of, you need to get things out of balance, and then you've lost your perspective. So what do we have then in that last chapter? In that last chapter of Jonah's flight. Jonah is both nothing and everything, but when it comes to it, it seems that he is so affected by this impossible position that he's being asked to stand in. He can't bear it, and so he opts for death instead. And even if there are much moves backwards and forwards between positions, nevertheless, that seems to be somewhere his ground place. Except that, of course, what happens when that gourd suddenly grows for him? When he sees the gourd, he has just asked to die, if you remember it. He sees the gourd, which is sheltering him from his evil. And it's verse 6 in chapter 4. The gourd is sheltering him from his evil. Vayismach Jonah ala kikayon simcha gedola. And Jonah rejoices about this gourd, for the sake of this gourd, about this gourd's existence, an exceedingly great joy, right? A great joy. And suddenly something else is big. From all the forces of nature being described as big, overwhelming, engulfing him in the sea and on the dry land, his imagination, suddenly there is something huge inside him. There had been a great sense of evil inside him, a great sense of things being out of joint, of nothing working, of not being able to decode the enigma of his existence. And suddenly there's a sense of great joy. Great joy for what? Yeah? For a piece of vegetation, right? It's a nothing, which is offering him a little shade against the sun. Right? And when that thing dies, suddenly there he is back to his death wish. So there's a kind of sense of him oscillating between extreme, right, a kind of mania, a kind of great joy and appreciation, and then the sense, if not that, then the death wish again. And standing up for his death wish, he vindicates his own, I'm angry unto death. What is the particular history of Jonah? I want to bring in one more fantastical midrash that tells us something perhaps about human beings in general, as this strange book would have us intuit the nature of human life. And that is a suggestion that's made in a number of sources, the Abarbanel, among others, that Jonah has a history that doesn't just go back, right? Doesn't just go back to his early childhood, to his sense of being engulfed in a world that is beyond his comprehension, but actually goes back to a pre-life life. Friends of Freud used to, or his patients used to mock him, used to laugh at him and say, well, if you think that our early infantile existence is always with us, and in some way we always remember that, then why not push it further back and say that before we came into the world altogether, that in some way that remains with us. They said this in some kind of mockery. But you have a midrash that takes this seriously. And the midrash suggests this, that Jonah was to be identified with a very particular historical figure who lived before his time. And that is with the son of the woman who was called the Sorfit, right, the woman from Sarfat, whom Eliyahu, you remember, whose son Eliyahu saved from death. This is in the first book of Kings, chapter 17. You remember that first this woman does loving kindness, acts in loving kindness to Eliyahu in the famine. He asks her to give him food, and she makes a cake out of her last remaining flour and oil. And the result is that there is suddenly a plenty of flour and oil once she's given that cake to Eliyahu. And then her son falls sick and dies, and Eliyahu brings him back to life. That son, says the Abarbanel, basing himself on a number of midrashic sources, grew to be later Jonah. That Jonah has within him, it's a really fantastical depth we're going into, the depths of time. He has within him a revived, a resurrected creature, a creature who died, a child who died and came back to life. And that, if you want to take it as a fantasy of some kind, is a fantasy that has to do not just with Jonah as a personal history, but perhaps with all human beings. The idea would be then, and the question would be, what does it mean to survive? How many survivals have we gone through in the course of a life, and in perhaps the course of the entry into the life, a life that was interrupted. Time was interrupted for a moment, and what we have is a moment in which, Freud described it, in which there is a survival. That suddenly, Freud's example was, if one is in a bad train accident, in his day that was the equivalent of the Challenger accident, that suddenly the world comes to an end, and one is knocked out, and one comes back to oneself afterwards, knowing that I was dead and I've come back to life. Now, there's a very fine line between I survived the disaster and I was revived from the dead, because I was not there to know the difference in that survival. There was no consciousness at that time. And so I live ever afterwards, not just with the gratitude of survival, with a sense of joy about survival, but with the other side, which is a kind of consciousness of something incomprehensible, an enigma of survival, something incomprehensible, a sense of having been chosen for a future that remains yet to be understood. That is, where is the continuity of my life? I wasn't there when I ceased to be. That I died, and of course I didn't know anything about this. And so now I'm in this strange situation of knowing and yet being unable to comprehend something about extreme vulnerability, if I could put it like that, extreme vulnerability and extreme sense of helplessness. Holocaust survivors apparently have a very high suicide rate. That is, resurrection from the dead isn't necessarily a cause for increased resilience and effectiveness. It may be that, but it will also be something else. And if, therefore, if we have a theme here of a trauma, of Jonah as the traumatized human being, what could the last chapter, the last dialogue between God and Jonah be telling him? Is God suggesting to Jonah that Jonah's wish somewhere to be either on one side or on the other, either to be alive or to be dead, either to be fully alive and invulnerable, or all right, if not, then finish me off. Let's at least have it clear. That is a denial. It's a denial of that in-between state. And God wants him somewhere to acknowledge precisely that in-between state, and to open up, therefore, the possibility of prayer, of a meaningful prayer, of a prayer that one can bear to pray, that one can find a way of holding within oneself. After all, what do we have at the end? We have a scene in which it's not only the people of Nineveh who fast, but the cattle. And the last words of the book, and it has to be significant, right? What are we left with as the last word of the book, right? What should be the meaning of the book? Ubehema Rabbah. In the end, it's about the human-animal existence, the existence of human beings as in some way sharing what it is to be a behema. Adam ubehema toshia Hashem. Right? One of the Psalms, Psalm Kuf Lamed Zayin. Adam ubehema toshia Hashem. Oh God, you save the human being and the animal. That is, there is a level which is nothing to be ashamed of, in which we are, like animals, piteously helpless. Piteously in the positive meaning of the word pity. After all, if there were not helplessness, if there were not infant helplessness, there wouldn't be the goodness of what the mother gives the baby. The mother wakes up before the baby has cried, right? That's all a baby can do in his helplessness, is cry. But the mother is so attuned to that helplessness that she tries to satisfy the baby. That there is a sense somewhere that she and the baby live not only in the physical realm, but in a realm of phantasmatic connection, that they are connected with each other, and his helplessness brings out her goodness. How else would one know about goodness in the world if there wasn't somebody who was helpless? And that can sound like a very dubious logic, but the fact is that it's actually so. Goodness comes out of human beings in response to helplessness. And I want to finish with that ethical side of what it is to be a human being / animal in the world, which seems to be the subject of Sefer Jonah. And this is by way of reference to a film I saw once, actually twice, I think, that struck me extremely. It was called The Weeping Camel. I don't know if any of you have seen this film. It's an ethnographic story of a group of Mongol nomads who are encamped in the Gobi Desert, and their livelihood is through their camels. This is their economy, through their camels. A mother camel gives birth to her young and then refuses to nurse the young. And you can see in the film, right? It's hard to imagine how the film crew made this film. It turns out the film crew were in position for months waiting for this to happen because they knew that it sometimes happened. That the mother animal, the mother camel, for some reason she seems to be in some kind of terror of her young and refuses to give suck to her young. And this young camel, with the fragility that you can see in the young, always, even when it comes to camels, you can see their fragility. This young one is doomed to die, which is a disaster. It would be a disaster for this whole, on the whole, very loving society. It's a society of families who live together in a big yurt. There's a lot of feeding going on there among the families. And if this young camel dies, it will be a tremendous economic loss. On that level alone, it will be a tremendous loss. But what's interesting in the film is the sense of disturbance in this society among these Mongols at the idea of a mother refusing to give nurse to her young. There's something about this that strikes them with a kind of horror, almost a metaphysical horror, right? Its sheer physicality becomes the seat of something metaphysical. It can't be. How can that happen? And then they get this idea that what they're going to do is they send some children and they go trotting off into the desert on their little donkeys, send some children to the nearest town where there is a music teacher, and you see them riding through the howling wastes of the midbar. And they know what they're looking for. They're looking for this music teacher, and they bring him back through the desert to the settlement, to where they all are. And we see again how the mother camel refuses to nurse her young, and then the music teacher, takes his instrument, a stringed instrument, and places it against the belly of the mother camel and starts playing. And you sense, right, it's incredible. That is, you sense that what is happening, and this is of course an act of imagination on our part. It seems that a tear is falling from camel's eye, and the camel surrenders. It moves away from its position of denial and hardness, and it liquefies in some sense. A tear falls from its eye, pathetic fallacy, and it begins to nurse its young. Suddenly, everything is right again with the world. Things were very wrath, and now they're right, but they have been engineered into being right. There's a sense that you can't forget how things are also wrong. Right? You can't forget the failure. And that it's the music that does it. That in some sense, the mother camel is persuaded by the movement and the energy going through her body somewhere to open her body again. And of course, the connection between the word rachem, to have compassion, and the rechem, the womb of the mother animal, which is so closed in this case, closing off Rahman, leads to discussions in the Talmud. Actually, I found this quite fascinating when I did a little research about questions like, would a mother animal, would an animal give suck to a young who doesn't belong to her? Would she suckle a young who doesn't belong, who's not her own? And the answer is, well, probably not, unless she had already given suck to her own. That is, there are certain cruelties there in the way of nature, and therefore, what do? We try to what's the word? We put salt in her wound in order to make her wound clench itself, and somewhere begin the processes of giving suck begin to happen. And the word for giving suck is lerachem. It's used as a technical expression, lerachem. And I haven't been able to find out, if any of you know, please let me know, but it seems that the Talmud is using the word not as a metaphor for having compassion. It's not being sentimental, but actually that is the word, to exercise the womb, to exercise a part of the human body. It's a phenomenology of compassion. It's the way the body is set for compassion. And when it comes to Jonah, it seems that he is the camel who can't find within himself to find compassion for this incomprehensible reality, which is life in this world, which seems on the one hand to be a place of possible civilization, of possible meaningfulness, and on the other hand is so extremely vulnerable. And God is trying to get Jonah simply to click in, to make connection, to make a connection with that part of himself that does value the simple fact of life and of vitality. You may have noticed that Jonah is called Jonah ben Amittai, and perhaps his truthfulness, the son of truthfulness, that is a kind of truthfulness that cannot yield sustenance. It's a truthfulness of, this is untenable, this position of the human being is untenable. I will not pray, I will not give succor. I will not find a way of crossing and standing somewhere between the two realities. God is trying to persuade him by asking him rhetorical questions at the end. And we don't know, of course, how Jonah in the story replies. He could reply, many possible replies. He could really be hard-headed, or he could somewhere just surrender, with a sense somewhere of putting aside what I would call a false self, a self that's based on fear, and acknowledging his helplessness, on the other hand, acknowledging his helplessness and acknowledging, therefore, the power of pity, the power of goodness in a world in which there is so much fear and so much danger. The fact that the last words of this book have to do with all those many, many, many human beings who don't know the difference between their right hand and their left. In other words, who are as good as infants. In fact, Rashi says something like that, if I remember rightly, that they are completely helpless. It's a way of looking at the world which brings out goodness from God. God is saying here, the book ends with God saying, should I not have pity, concern, the wish for life for all these myriads of human beings who don't know the difference between their right hand and their left, and all that cattle? Now, all that cattle, the Hema Rabbah, is what is left resounding in our ears when we finish reading the book. And it has a strange effect, right? It has a kind of, right, it's almost a comic effect in some ways. What, you're bringing down the whole human profile to an animal-like existence. That's what God cares about. And yet what is really happening, it seems to me, and it's happening for those who read Megillat, Sefer Jonah, even if it doesn't happen to Jonah, we don't know, there's uncertainty there. What happens to the reader, what happens to those who live this, is a sense of opening up other perspectives on being. That we don't always have to be our best and our most sophisticated and civilized selves. That perhaps that moment is a moment on Yom Kippur, is that moment when all the stories, all the frozen cells can melt, can dissolve, and some other way of being, this is what I've called helplessness, can become part of a dynamic of chesed, of flowing chesed, in which the mother gives suck and the child sucks, and we don't know who wants the situation more than the other. In other words, there is great desire on both sides, only it does need a kind of human softening to accept such terms, to accept such a human condition between two modes of being in the world. Thank you.